The Indian Ocean was unusually calm. Just before sunrise, the sea stretched endlessly beneath a sky painted in pale shades of blue and gold. Gentle waves rolled across the surface, reflecting the first light of day. A warm breeze carried the scent of salt and distant rain, while gulls circled far above, their cries fading into the vast silence. From a deck of a richly laden Mogul treasure ship, the morning seemed no different from countless others. Merchants prepared for another day at sea. Sailors adjusted heavy canvas sails. Guards leaned against polished muskets, confident that the hardest part of the voyage was already behind them. After months of sailing across the Arabian Sea, they believed they were finally returning home. Hidden below the wooden decks lay one of the richest collections of treasure ever assembled. Gold coins from distant kingdoms, silver bars stacked in secure holds, silk from China, Persian carpets, ivory carvings, precious gemstones that sparkled even in the dim lantern light. Chests sealed with wax carried fortunes belonging to merchants, nobles, and members of the Mughal court. Few ships in history had ever carried such extraordinary wealth. Its destination was the thriving ports of the Mughal Empire, one of the wealthiest and most powerful empires on earth. Its ruler, Emperor Aurangzeb, governed millions of people, and his influence reached from the mountains of Afghanistan to the warm waters of the Indian Ocean. The ship seemed untouchable. Yet beyond the horizon, another vessel was watching. Its blackened hull blended with the morning shadows. Torn sails bore the scars of countless storms. The ship looked worn, almost forgotten by the sea itself. But appearances concealed a deadly truth. Aboard that vessel stood a man who had already broken nearly every rule of his world. His name was Henry Every. Unlike the legendary pirates celebrated in novels and films, Every did not seek fame. He avoided crowded ports, changed identities whenever necessary, and trusted very few people. Even among pirates, he remained an enigma. His crew had followed him across thousands of miles of open ocean. They had survived violent storms, hunger, disease, and mutiny. Each hardship brought them closer to one extraordinary opportunity. Today, they intended to seize a fortune so vast that it could change the course of history. Every stood silently near the quarterdeck, studying the distant silhouette through a brass telescope. He knew exactly what he was looking at. The Ganjai Sawai, often translated as exceeding treasure, was no ordinary merchant ship. It was among the most valuable vessels sailing anywhere in the world. Protected by armed guards and heavy cannons, it represented the wealth and prestige of the Mughal Empire itself. Most captains would never dare attack such a prize. Every saw something different. He saw a chance that might never come again. Around him, the crew moved with quiet determination. Muskets were inspected. Cannon crews prepared powder charges. Blades were sharpened one final time. No one spoke louder than necessary. Experienced sailors understood that the moments before battle were often the quietest. The sea itself seemed to hold its breath. As the distance between the two ships slowly narrowed, sunlight climbed higher above the horizon. The treasure ship still appeared unaware of the danger approaching from behind. Confidence can be as dangerous as any storm. For months, rumors had spread across ports from Madagascar to the Red Sea. Sailors whispered about an English pirate commanding a swift vessel known as the Fancy. Some claimed he possessed supernatural luck. Others believed he had vanished into the sea itself after impossible escapes. Most dismissed the stories as exaggeration. Soon, those stories would become reality. What made Henry Every truly dangerous was not overwhelming firepower. It was patience. He understood wind. He understood currents. He understood fear. Rather than rushing into battle, he allowed the sea to become his ally. Every adjustment of the sails, every change in direction, every moment of waiting brought his ship into a more favorable position. His greatest weapon was careful planning. Far below deck, the pirates checked powder stores one last time. The smell of sulfur mixed with damp timber and tar. Lanterns swayed gently with the motion of the ship, casting long shadows across rows of cannonballs stacked neatly beside thick coils of rope. Some crew members quietly whispered prayers. Others sharpened cutlasses already worn smooth from years at sea. Many had gambled everything to follow Henry Every. There would be no turning back now. Meanwhile, aboard the Mogul vessel, daily routines continued. Meals were prepared. Accounts were recorded. Passengers admired the endless blue horizon, believing the greatest dangers of their voyage were already behind them. Few noticed the dark shape growing larger behind them. History often changes without warning. Sometimes it begins with a single sail appearing on the horizon. Within the next few hours, cannon fire would echo across the Indian Ocean. Empires would demand justice. Governments would launch one of the first truly global manhunts in history. And the name Henry Every would become feared across Europe, Asia, and the Atlantic world. Yet to understand how an ordinary English sailor came to challenge one of the richest empires on Earth, we must travel back many years, to a time before he became the world's most wanted pirate. Back to a young man standing on the windswept coast of England, dreaming not of piracy, but simply of the sea. Long before governments across Europe offered rewards for his capture, before merchants whispered his name with fear, and before emperors demanded justice, Henry Every was simply another English sailor searching for a better life. His early years remain one of history's greatest mysteries. Unlike kings or famous admirals, pirates rarely left behind detailed records of their childhoods. Parish registers disappeared, letters were lost, and many stories were exaggerated decades after their deaths. Historians believe Henry Every, sometimes recorded as John Avery or Bridgman, was likely born around 1659 in the county of Devon, in southwest England. Devon was a place shaped by the sea. Its rugged coastline stretched for miles, broken by hidden coves, steep cliffs, and small fishing villages where nearly every family depended on the ocean. The smell of salt and smoke drifted through narrow streets. Fishing boats left before dawn, while larger merchant vessels sailed for London, the Mediterranean, West Africa, and the Caribbean. For a young boy growing up there, the sea was impossible to ignore. It promised adventure. It promised fortune, but it also demanded sacrifice. Life in 17th century England was difficult for ordinary people. Harvests could fail without warning. Disease spread quickly through crowded towns. Wages were low, and opportunities were limited. For many young men, the sea offered the only realistic chance to earn more than a lifetime of labor on land. Yet that opportunity came at a price. A sailor's life was harsh beyond modern imagination. The wooden ships of the era were cramped and constantly damp. Fresh water spoiled after weeks sat. Fresh water often turned stale after only a few weeks at sea. Salted beef became so tough that sailors sometimes joked it was easier to carve than to eat. Hard biscuits, known as hardtack, were frequently filled with weevils. Many men simply knocked the insects out against the side of the barrel before taking another bite. Below deck, the air was thick with the smell of damp timber, tar, sweat, and gunpowder. Rats darted between barrels, and cockroaches thrived in the darkness. Sleep came in cramped hammocks that swung with every movement of the ship, while storms could throw a man from his bed without warning. Disease was an even greater enemy than the sea itself. Scurvy slowly weakened crews deprived of fresh fruit. Dysentery spread through contaminated water. Fevers swept from ship to ship, sometimes claiming dozens of lives before land appeared again on the horizon. Yet despite these hardships, thousands of young Englishmen continued to sign aboard merchant ships and naval vessels. The promise of steady wages, or perhaps the dream of one fortunate voyage, was enough to outweigh the risks. Henry Every was one of them, although much of his early career remains uncertain. Surviving records suggest he became an experienced sailor long before he entered the world of piracy. He learned how to read the wind, trim sails, navigate dangerous coastlines, and work as part of a disciplined crew. These were skills earned through years of relentless labor, not overnight adventure. By the late 17th century, Europe was locked in a struggle for wealth and influence across the world's oceans. England, France, Spain, Portugal, and the Dutch Republic competed fiercely for colonies, trade routes, and precious cargo. Merchant fleets carried sugar, tobacco, spices, silk, silver, and gold across thousands of miles of open sea. Every successful voyage enriched kingdoms. Every lost ship weakened them. The oceans had become the highways of global commerce. And where wealth traveled, violence often followed. Some sailors served in royal navies. Others joined merchant companies. A few accepted commissions as privateers, captains legally authorized during wartime to attack enemy shipping. To governments, they were useful weapons. To those they attacked, they looked little different from pirates. The line between patriot and outlaw was often thinner than people imagined. When wars ended, many privateers suddenly found themselves unemployed. Their ships remained, their weapons remained, their skills remained, but the wages disappeared. For some, piracy became less a romantic choice than a desperate one. Henry Every understood this. Henry Every understood this world better than most. Years spent at sea had taught him a lesson that every experienced sailor eventually learned. The greatest dangers did not always come from storms. Sometimes they came from the men who owned the ships. Merchant captains often delayed wages for months. Some disappeared with the money entirely. Sailors signed contracts they could not read, then found themselves trapped on voyages far longer than promised. Food was cut to save costs. Water was rationed. Punishments were harsh, and a single act of disobedience could end with a whipping in front of the entire crew. Life aboard many merchant vessels was ruled by strict discipline. The captain's word was law. There were no appeals, no courts, no second chances. For ordinary sailors, survival often depended on keeping their heads down and enduring whatever hardships came their way. Henry Every watched all of this. He saw honest men return from years at sea with little more than worn clothing and aching bones. He watched wealthy investors celebrate profitable voyages while the crews who had risked their lives received only a tiny fraction of the reward. The imbalance was impossible to ignore. Across England's ports, conversations in crowded taverns often drifted toward the same subjects. A captain who had cheated his crew, a merchant who had vanished without paying wages, a privateer who had become rich almost overnight, or another pirate who had disappeared with a fortune beyond imagination. Some of those stories were wildly exaggerated. Others were true. No one could always tell the difference. One rainy evening, as lantern light flickered across the wooden tables of a harbor tavern, old sailors traded tales from distant oceans. They spoke of Madagascar, where pirates were rumored to repair their ships beyond the reach of European governments. They described the Red Sea, where heavily laden merchant vessels returned from India carrying unimaginable wealth. To a young sailor listening in silence, those stories planted dangerous ideas, not because they glorified piracy, but because they revealed a simple truth. The richest ships in the world often sailed far from the protection of powerful navies. The oceans were vast. Governments were slow. Opportunity moved with the tides. By the early 1690s, England was still feeling the effects of years of war and economic uncertainty. Thousands of experienced seamen searched desperately for employment. Competition for positions aboard respectable ships grew fierce. When an offer finally came for Henry Every, it appeared to be exactly the opportunity he needed. The voyage promised good pay. It promised adventure. Most importantly, it promised a future. The expedition was organized to serve the Spanish crown, which had hired English sailors to attack French shipping in the Caribbean. Every accepted a position as the first mate aboard a powerful vessel called the Charles II. It seemed like the beginning of a respectable career. The ship was large, heavily armed, and commanded by experienced officers. Its mission was legal, its destination well planned, and its crew filled with hardened sailors eager for regular wages. No one aboard could have imagined that this single voyage would change maritime history. Because before the Charles II ever reached its battlefield, frustration began to spread among the crew. Weeks turned into months. Promises went unfulfilled. The men waited in port for supplies, orders, and, most importantly, the wages they had been promised. Money failed to arrive. Food grew scarce. Tempers grew shorter with each passing day. Every morning brought fresh rumors. Tomorrow, some officers insisted. The payment is coming. But tomorrow became another week, then another month. For men already living on the edge of survival, patience began to run out. Among the restless crew, one officer remained unusually calm. Henry Every. He rarely shouted. He rarely argued. Instead, he watched. He listened. He learned which sailors had lost faith in their commanders. He learned who could still be trusted. Most importantly, he realized something that would soon change every life aboard the Charles II. The greatest threat to the voyage was no longer the enemy waiting across the ocean. It was the growing anger inside the ship itself. As darkness settled over the harbor one quiet night in the spring of 1694, a handful of men gathered in whispers beneath the silent rigging. They had reached a decision from which there could be no return. By sunrise, the Charles II would no longer belong to its owners, and Henry Every would begin the extraordinary transformation from an overlooked English sailor into one of history's most infamous pirates. The harbor lay silent beneath a moonless sky. Only the gentle slap of water against the hull disturbed the stillness. The towering masts of the Charles II rose like dark silhouettes against the stars, their rigging swaying softly in the cool night breeze. Lanterns burned low across the deck, casting faint pools of yellow light that barely reached the shadows. Most of the officers were asleep. The ship had spent months anchored in the Spanish port of Corunna, waiting for supplies, official orders, and, most importantly, the wages that had been promised to every sailor on board. Those wages had never arrived. For weeks, frustration had spread through the crew like a slow-burning fire. Men who had crossed oceans expecting honest work now found themselves trapped aboard a ship with empty pockets and little hope of being paid. Food was becoming scarce, tempers were short, and trust in the expedition's leaders had nearly vanished. Every evening, the conversations grew quieter. No longer complaints. Plans. Henry Every listened more than he spoke. He understood that an angry crew was dangerous, but an organized crew could change history. Late that night, while much of the ship slept, a small group of trusted sailors gathered near the mainmast. They spoke in whispers, careful not to wake the officers quartered below. There was no dramatic speech, no waving of swords, only a simple question. How much longer do we wait? No one answered immediately. The silence itself was enough. They had already waited too long. Every step forward. According to later accounts, he spoke calmly, without shouting or threatening anyone. He reminded the men of the promises that had been broken. Months of service without wages. Endless delays. Officers who assured them that payment would come soon. Soon had become never. Then he offered another path. Take the ship. Elect their own captain. Sail where opportunity, not employers, would decide their future. It was an extraordinary proposal. Under English law, it was also an act of treason. Any man who joined him risked execution if captured. Yet one by one, the sailors nodded. One by one, the men stepped forward. No written agreement was signed. No formal vote was recorded. Each sailor made a silent decision that would separate his life into two parts. Everything before that night and everything after. Some were driven by desperation, others by anger, a few by the hope that one bold gamble might earn more than a lifetime of honest wages. Whatever their reasons, they all understood the same truth. If they failed, there would be no prison sentence waiting for them. Piracy against the crowns of Europe often ended at the gallows. Shortly after midnight, the mutiny began. It unfolded with remarkable discipline. The conspirators moved quietly across the deck, avoiding unnecessary noise. They had no desire for a bloody confrontation. Every knew that violence would only divide the crew before their journey had even begun. The first officers were awakened not by shouting, but by armed sailors standing outside their cabins. Pistols, cutlasses, muskets. The message required few words. Resistance would cost lives. Most officers quickly realized they had little chance of reclaiming control. Many had only moments earlier believed they commanded the ship. Now they found themselves surrounded by men they had ordered about for months. Remarkably, very little blood was spilled. Henry Every had no interest in revenge. His goal was the ship, not slaughter. Those unwilling to join the mutiny were given a choice. They could leave peacefully when the opportunity arose, or they could remain under the new command if they accepted the crew's decision. For the standards of the 17th century, it was an unusually restrained takeover. Before dawn, the Charles II no longer belonged to its owners. It belonged to the crew. As the first rays of sunlight crept over the harbor, the ship quietly raised anchor. The heavy iron links of the anchor chain groaned as they disappeared beneath the deck. Sailors climbed the rigging with practiced speed, unfurling great sheets of canvas that caught the morning wind. The vessel eased away from the harbor. No cannon fired. No alarms echoed across the port. By the time authorities realized something was wrong, the Charles II was already disappearing toward the open Atlantic. The mutiny had succeeded. Once safely beyond immediate pursuit, the crew gathered on deck. The sea stretched endlessly in every direction, free from the laws of any kingdom. Here, far from courts and governors, the men began building a new order. Unlike the rigid hierarchy they had left behind, pirate crews often operated with surprising elements of democracy. Captains were usually elected. Major decisions could be discussed among the crew. Loot was divided according to agreed shares rather than the whims of wealthy investors. This did not make pirates noble. They remained violent criminals who robbed, kidnapped, and sometimes killed innocent people. But life aboard many pirate ships could offer experienced sailors greater influence, and often greater rewards, than life aboard merchant vessels. Henry Every was chosen as captain, not because he was the loudest, not because he inspired fear, but because he had earned the confidence of the men around him. His calm judgment, seamanship, and careful planning had already distinguished him long before the mutiny. Now those qualities would determine whether they lived or died. The crew made one more symbolic decision. The Charles II would carry its old name no longer. She would become the Fancy. It was more than a change of paint on the stern. It marked the birth of a new identity. Over the following weeks, the crew worked tirelessly to transform their ship into one of the fastest pirate vessels sailing the Atlantic. Heavy structures that slowed the ship were removed. The hull was cleaned. The rigging was improved. Cannons were repositioned for greater efficiency. Everything unnecessary was stripped away. Speed would become their greatest weapon. A faster ship could choose when to fight. It could outrun naval patrols. It could overtake heavily loaded merchant vessels before help arrived. Henry Every understood that survival depended less on brute force than on mobility. The Fancy soon became leaner, lighter, and significantly quicker than many ships of similar size. It was no longer simply a stolen vessel. It had become a predator. Standing at the helm one cool evening, Every watched the western horizon disappear beneath the setting sun. Behind him lay England, the Royal Navy, the life he had once known. Ahead stretched thousands of miles of open ocean and possibilities that no lawful sailor could ever pursue. There was no turning back now. Every port would carry his description. Every governor would be encouraged to arrest him. Every royal flag represented danger. Yet somewhere beyond Africa, beyond the Cape of Good Hope, beyond the vast Indian Ocean, sailed merchant fleets carrying fortunes that seemed almost beyond belief. Henry Every had not become a pirate merely to steal a handful of cargoes. He was searching for something far greater, a prize so extraordinary that one successful voyage might allow every man aboard the Fancy to retire forever. At the time, none of them knew exactly where they would find it. But history would soon remember that decision as the beginning of one of the most daring pirate expeditions ever undertaken. Their destination was the Indian Ocean, and waiting there was a treasure that would shake the world. The Atlantic Ocean showed little mercy to those who challenged it. Weeks after leaving Europe behind, the Fancy had become little more than a dark silhouette against an endless expanse of water. Day after day, nothing broke the horizon except rolling swells, distant clouds, and the occasional flock of seabirds that hinted land might still exist somewhere beyond sight. Life aboard the ship settled into a relentless rhythm. Before sunrise, the watch changed. Barefoot sailors climbed the rigging, their hands blackened by tar and rough hemp rope. Others scrubbed the deck with seawater and sandstone, working until the wooden planks gleamed beneath the morning light. The smell of salt mixed with damp oak, smoke from the galley fire, and the sharp scent of pitch used to seal the hull against leaks. There were no idle passengers aboard the Fancy. Every man worked. Every man understood that the sea punished even the smallest mistake. Henry rarely raised his voice. Instead, he walked the deck with quiet confidence, observing everything. He noticed a loose knot before it became a broken sail. He spotted dark clouds hours before the first gust reached the ship. He listened to experienced sailors who understood currents better than maps. This calm leadership earned him something more valuable than fear. It earned trust. Many pirate captains ruled through terror, believing cruelty kept crews obedient. Every believed something different. A frightened crew fought poorly. A respected crew fought as one. That did not mean discipline disappeared. Arguments were settled quickly. Theft from fellow crewmen was punished severely. Cowardice during battle was treated as a betrayal of every life aboard. Pirate ships often operated under written agreements known as articles, outlining how loot would be divided, what behavior was expected, and the penalties for breaking the rules. Though the exact articles used aboard the Fancy have not survived, similar pirate codes emphasize cooperation because survival depended on it. Contrary to popular legend, constant chaos would have destroyed any pirate crew long before they captured a valuable prize. As the voyage continued south, the weather changed. Warm Atlantic winds gradually gave way to colder currents. The sea became rougher. Gray skies hung low over the masts, and towering waves crashed against the bow with tremendous force. Water swept across the deck, soaking clothing already stiff with salt. The ship groaned under the strain. Every creak of timber reminded the crew that a wooden vessel was alive in its own way. The hull flexed. The mast bent. The rigging sang in the wind. More than one sailor wondered whether the sea itself intended to claim them before any enemy ever could. Then came the Cape. The southern tip of Africa was feared by sailors across the world. Known today as the Cape of Good Hope, it had earned a far less hopeful reputation among 17th century mariners. Here, the Atlantic and Indian Oceans collided. Powerful currents met unpredictable winds. Storms appeared with astonishing speed. Ships that had survived years at sea sometimes disappeared within a single night. As the Fancy approached those waters, the sky darkened long before sunset. Heavy clouds swallowed the horizon. The wind shifted suddenly. A deep rumble echoed across the ocean. "Reef the sails," came the order. Men raced upward into the rigging despite the growing storm. Rain lashed their faces. The canvas snapped violently overhead. Below, others secured loose barrels, tightened ropes, and checked the cannon lashings. A single unsecured gun could smash through the hull if thrown across the deck by heavy seas. Then the storm arrived, not as a gentle rain, but as a wall of wind. The ship climbed towering waves only to plunge into deep valleys of black water. Spray exploded across the bow, drenching everyone within seconds. Thunder rolled overhead, while lightning briefly illuminated mountains of water surrounding the vessel. Visibility disappeared. The world became nothing but darkness, roaring wind, and crashing seas. Some sailors prayed aloud. Others gripped ropes until their hands bled. Henry remained near the helm. His face was soaked by freezing rain, but his voice remained steady. There was no panic, only commands. The helmsman adjusted course by fractions. The sailmaster timed each maneuver with the rhythm of the waves. Hours passed. Then, slowly, the wind began to weaken. Morning revealed a battered but surviving ship. Several sails had been torn. One mast required repairs. 2 men had been injured, but the Fancy still floated. The crew looked at one another with exhausted relief. They had crossed one of the most dangerous stretches of ocean on Earth, and beyond it lay the Indian Ocean. Few aboard realized that the greatest danger was no longer the sea. It was the wealth waiting beyond the horizon. For somewhere to the northeast, immense treasure fleets sailed between India, Arabia, and the Red Sea. Ships carrying riches beyond anything most Europeans had ever seen. Henry every intended to find them. And before long, another group of pirates would appear on the horizon, bringing with them an alliance that promised unimaginable fortune and unimaginable consequences. Weeks after surviving the violent waters around the Cape of Good Hope, the Fancy entered a different world. The air grew warmer. The sea changed from the dark gray of the Atlantic to deep shades of brilliant blue. Flying fish skimmed across the waves, disappearing almost as quickly as they appeared. Tropical clouds drifted lazily overhead, while long swells carried the ship toward the western Indian Ocean. For the first time in months, the crew could feel that they had reached unfamiliar waters. Ahead lay one of the most important crossroads of global trade. Every year, merchant ships carrying silk, spices, porcelain, ivory, coffee, silver, and gold crossed these seas. Some sailed from India to Arabia. Others traveled between East Africa and Southeast Asia. Where trade flourished, opportunity followed. And so did pirates. Among sailors, one island had become almost legendary. Madagascar. To European governments, it was distant, difficult to control, and far beyond the reach of most naval patrols. To pirates, it offered something even more valuable: freedom. Its long coastline was filled with hidden bays where ships could anchor safely. Fresh water flowed from inland rivers. Timber could be cut to repair damaged masts. Local trade networks sometimes supplied food, livestock, and other necessities. For crews living beyond the law, it became an ideal refuge. Not a kingdom, not a nation, but a place where men who had abandoned ordinary lives could disappear from the maps of Europe. As the Fancy approached one of these sheltered anchorages, several ships already rested at anchor. Some flew no flag at all. Others displayed worn colors from nations they no longer served. Their hulls carried scars from battles fought across half the world. Smoke rose gently from fires burning along the shoreline, where sailors repaired boats, patched sails, and traded supplies beneath swaying palm trees. The scene resembled a busy harbor, yet there were no customs officers, no royal governors, no courts, only men living by their own rules. Henry every stepped ashore after months at sea. The solid ground felt strangely unfamiliar beneath his boots. Around him echoed a dozen different languages: English, Dutch, French, Portuguese. African traders bargained with European sailors. Former privateers drank beside escaped servants. Experienced navigators compared rumors of rich merchant convoys. Every conversation seemed to circle back to one question: where was the next fortune waiting? News traveled quickly through pirate communities. Within days, every learned that several other captains shared his ambitions. Among them were men already feared across the Indian Ocean. Thomas Tew, Joseph Farrow, William Mays, Richard Want. Each commanded experienced crews. Each possessed fast, well-armed ships. Each understood that attacking heavily defended treasure vessels alone could end in disaster. Together, however, they might succeed where individual ships could not. Pirates were rarely united. Greed often divided them long before any navy could. Arguments over loot, leadership, and strategy frequently ended alliances before they truly began. Henry every knew this, so when discussions began about cooperating, he approached them with caution. No captain wished to surrender authority. Yet everyone recognized the extraordinary opportunity lying ahead. Merchant convoys returning from the Red Sea carried unimaginable wealth. Pilgrims completed the annual journey to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Nobles traveled with personal fortunes. Imperial officials transported taxes collected across vast provinces. If even one of those great ships could be captured, every crew involved might become richer than they had ever imagined. Evenings on Madagascar became planning sessions. Lantern light flickered across rough wooden tables. Maps, many incomplete and often inaccurate, were spread open. Captains debated currents, prevailing winds, and likely sailing routes. Experienced navigators marked narrow passages where heavily laden merchant ships would struggle to escape. The discussions lasted deep into the night. Some favored quick attacks on isolated merchantmen. Others argued for patience. Henry Every belonged to the second group. He believed the greatest prize required discipline. Small victories, one sailor later remembered hearing, often distract men from greater fortunes. Whether those exact words were spoken is uncertain, but they perfectly reflected every strategy. The pirate captains eventually reached an agreement. They would sail together, not as a single navy, but as an alliance. Each captain retained command of his own ship. Each crew kept its own officers. Yet information would be shared. Lookouts would watch for the same convoy. Signals between ships would coordinate attacks. It was a fragile partnership built on mutual ambition rather than trust. Everyone understood it could collapse at any moment. Before leaving Madagascar, the Fancy underwent one final inspection. Fresh water filled every barrel. Salted meat and dried peas were loaded into the hold. Gunpowder was carefully sealed against moisture. Cannons were cleaned until their dark iron barrels gleamed in the tropical sunlight. Blacksmiths repaired damaged anchors. Carpenters strengthened weakened beams. Sailmakers stitched fresh patches into canvas worn by months of wind and salt. Every knew that once they sailed north, there would be few opportunities to make repairs. The next stage of the voyage demanded absolute readiness. One evening, as the sun disappeared beyond the horizon in brilliant shades of crimson and orange, Henry Every stood alone on a rocky cliff overlooking the bay. Below him, the pirate ships rocked gently at anchor. The warm breeze carried the scent of smoke, salt water, and flowering trees from the island's interior. Somewhere beyond that endless horizon lay the Red Sea. Somewhere beyond it sailed the richest fleet in the Indian Ocean. He could not know exactly when they would appear, only that they would. History often turns on patience. The greatest hunters are rarely the fastest. They are the ones willing to wait. Within weeks, the pirate alliance would leave Madagascar behind and begin stalking the sea lanes of the Mughal Empire. And before long, a single lookout's cry from the masthead would set in motion one of the most famous pirate chases in history. The pirate fleet left Madagascar before dawn. A pale orange glow spread across the eastern horizon as one ship after another caught the morning wind. Their sails slowly filled, ropes creaked under tension, and the calm waters of the bay gave way to the vast openness of the Indian Ocean. No cheers echoed across the decks. No songs marked their departure. Every man understood that this voyage was unlike any before it. They were no longer searching for ordinary merchant ships. They were hunting one of the richest fleets on Earth. For weeks, the pirates sailed north along the East African coast before turning toward the entrance of the Red Sea. The weather favored them. Warm trade winds pushed the ships steadily onward. During the day, dolphins occasionally raced alongside the bows, while flying fish burst from the waves like silver arrows. At night, the sea seemed almost magical. Tiny glowing organisms shimmered beneath the hull, leaving long trails of blue-green light behind each ship. Beautiful, peaceful, almost enough to make a sailor forget how dangerous these waters truly were. The entrance to the Red Sea was one of the busiest maritime crossroads in the world. Every year, thousands of pilgrims traveled to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Merchant convoys carried spices from India, coffee from Arabia, silk from China, and precious metals from across Asia and Africa. Many ships sailed under the protection of powerful empires. Some belonged to wealthy trading companies. Others carried private fortunes so enormous that a single successful voyage could change the fate of entire families. Henry Every knew that somewhere among them would be the opportunity he had crossed half the world to find. Life aboard the Fancy became a test of patience. Each morning followed the same routine. Lookouts climbed to the crow's nest before sunrise. The cook prepared simple meals of salted meat, dried peas, and hard biscuits. Carpenters inspected the hull for damage. Gunners cleaned cannon barrels and checked powder stores. Nothing was left to chance. a neglected rope, a cracked pulley, a damp powder charge. Any one of them could decide the outcome of a battle. Hours passed, then days, sometimes an entire week without sighting another sail. The ocean was vast enough to hide thousands of ships. A captain could spend months searching and never encounter the vessel he sought. That uncertainty tested the crew more than any storm. Some sailors grew restless. Others quietly wondered whether the treasure fleet had already passed. Every remained calm. He refused to chase rumors or exhaust his men in desperate pursuits. Instead, he relied on experience. Merchant fleets followed predictable seasons. Pilgrims returned at roughly the same time each year. Wind and current limited where large ships could safely sail. The sea looked endless, but commerce followed patterns. If he understood those patterns, the treasure would eventually come to him. One afternoon, a cry echoed from high above the deck. "Sail! To the east!" Every conversation stopped. Dozens of eyes turned toward the horizon. Far away, barely visible against the haze, a tiny white triangle appeared. Then another. Then another. The lookout adjusted his telescope. There are several ships. Excitement spread across the pirate fleet. Cannons were loaded. Weapons inspected. The Alliance changed course together. As the hours passed, the distant sails grew clearer. Yet disappointment soon followed. The vessels proved to be ordinary merchant ships carrying modest cargo. Useful, but not the fortune they had risked everything to find. Some captains wanted to attack anyway. Henry Every disagreed. He reminded them that every unnecessary battle consumed ammunition, damaged ships, and revealed their presence to future targets. A hunter who frightened the forest rarely caught its largest prey. Reluctantly, the pirate captains allowed the convoy to continue. Some sailors grumbled. Others questioned whether caution would leave them empty-handed. Every ignored the criticism. He believed patience would soon be rewarded. Days later, fresh intelligence arrived. A small coastal vessel had been intercepted. Its frightened crew revealed news that instantly changed everything. The Great Mogul convoy had departed the Red Sea. It was heading south. Among its ships was one of the largest and wealthiest vessels in the world, the Ganj Isawai. Alongside it sailed another heavily armed escort, known as the Fateh Muhammad. Together they carried pilgrims, merchants, nobles, guards, and immense quantities of gold, silver, jewels, and valuable cargo. The prize Every had imagined was no longer a rumor. It was real, and it was sailing directly toward the Indian Ocean. That evening, the pirate captains gathered once more. The atmosphere was different now. The maps spread across the table no longer represented possibilities. They represented a coming battle. Some argued they should attack immediately if the first ship appeared. Others insisted they should wait until the entire convoy was within reach. Every studied the charts in silence. Finally, he spoke. If we waste our strength on the first target, the greatest prize may escape. The room fell quiet. He was right. The escort ship might carry wealth, but the Ganj Isawai carried history. The decision was made. They would pursue the convoy with every sail they possessed. Ahead lay a race across the Indian Ocean. A race in which a single shift of the wind could determine whether Henry Every became one of history's richest pirates or disappeared forever into obscurity. As darkness settled over the sea, the pirate ships trimmed their sails for maximum speed. Somewhere beyond the black horizon, the treasure fleet was already underway. Neither side had yet seen the other, but destiny was drawing them together. The wind arrived before sunrise. A steady breeze swept across the Indian Ocean, filling the sails of the Fancy until the canvas stretched tight against the masts. The ship leaned gently as it gathered speed, cutting through the calm blue water with growing purpose. Every man aboard sensed the change. This was no longer a search. It was a pursuit. From the crow's nest, the lookout scanned the eastern horizon hour after hour through a brass telescope. The morning haze blurred the line where sea met sky, making distant ships appear and disappear like ghosts. Below, the crew waited, some sharpened cutlasses already worn from years of use. Others checked flintlocks, carefully keeping powder dry inside leather pouches. Cannon crews inspected every wheel, tackle, and rammer. A single broken rope during battle could turn a weapon into a deadly hazard for the men operating it. No one knew when the first sighting would come, only that it would. Late that afternoon, the cry finally echoed across the deck. Sails to the northeast. The word spread instantly. Henry Every climbed onto the quarterdeck and raised his telescope. Far beyond the shimmering water, several white sails caught the sunlight. Not one, not two. A convoy. The distance was still great, but experienced eyes could already read the shapes of the vessels. Large, deep in the water, heavy with cargo. Exactly the kind of ships they had crossed half the world to find. The pirate alliance immediately altered course. Canvas strained against the strengthening wind as each captain ordered every possible sail raised. The Fancy surged forward. Unlike many merchant ships, she had been rebuilt for speed. Her lighter hull and carefully trimmed rigging allowed her to gain steadily on slower vessels carrying enormous loads. Still, the chase would not be easy. The Mogul convoy had experienced captains of its own. They knew these waters, and they understood the danger posed by pirates. As sunset approached, details slowly became visible. The convoy stretched across the horizon. Some ships sailed close together. Others drifted farther apart as changing winds disrupted their formation. From the Fancy, the pirates could just make out flashes of sunlight reflecting from polished cannon barrels. These were not defenseless merchants. Many carried armed guards. Several mounted heavy guns capable of destroying a pirate ship if given the chance. The coming battle would demand precision rather than reckless courage. Night fell before either side closed the distance. Darkness swallowed the ocean. Only scattered lanterns aboard the distant convoy hinted at its position. Henry Every gathered his officers. A single lantern illuminated the chart spread across a rough wooden table. "We attack at first light," he said quietly. "No unnecessary gunfire. Close the distance first. The closer we are, the less time they have to prepare." The officers nodded. Everyone understood the plan. Surprise would be worth more than any cannon. The crew slept little. Some lay awake staring into the darkness above the deck. Others whispered quietly about what tomorrow might bring. A few admitted fears they had kept hidden for months. Not fear of battle, fear of failure. Many had abandoned lawful lives forever. There could be no return to England. No peaceful retirement if this expedition failed. Everything depended upon the coming day. Dawn arrived beneath a sky streaked with crimson and gold. Thin mist drifted across the sea. As sunlight strengthened, the treasure convoy emerged once more. This time it was much closer. The pirates could clearly distinguish individual ships. Colorful flags fluttered from tall masts. Rows of cannon lined polished gun decks. Crewmen hurried across crowded decks, preparing for another ordinary day at sea. They still did not realize who was approaching from behind. Then, almost suddenly, one ship broke away from the convoy. It was smaller than the largest vessel, but still heavily laden. Henry Every lowered his telescope. "The Fateh Mohammed," he said, "one of the richest escort ships in the fleet." Some pirate captains immediately urged an attack. Others wanted to continue chasing the larger prize. Every faced a difficult decision. If they ignored the escort, it might strengthen the defenses of the convoy. If they attacked it, the greatest treasure aboard the Ganjai Sawai might escape. Seconds stretched into silence. Finally, Every gave his order. Take the escort first. The decision was practical. A swift victory would provide supplies, intelligence, and valuable cargo while removing one of the convoy's strongest defenders. The pirate ships spread into attack formation. The distance closed rapidly. Across the water, alarm bells finally rang aboard the Fateh Mohammed. Sailors rushed toward the guns. Officers shouted commands. Passengers stared toward the approaching ships, struggling to understand what they were seeing. Then a pirate flag climbed slowly into the morning sky, black against the rising sun. There could be no misunderstanding now. The hunt was over. The battle had begun. The first cannon shot did not come from the pirates. It came from the Fateh Mohammed. A brilliant flash erupted from the ship's starboard battery, followed a heartbeat later by a deafening roar that rolled across the Indian Ocean. Thick white smoke poured from the gun ports, momentarily hiding the vessel behind a drifting cloud of gunpowder. A heavy iron cannonball skipped across the sea, throwing up towering columns of water before disappearing harmlessly behind the Fancy. The range was still too great. Henry Every lowered his telescope without the slightest change in expression. He had expected this. Merchant captains often opened fire as soon as an enemy entered range, hoping to force an attacker to keep its distance. But Every had spent years learning something many commanders never fully understood: a cannon. Henry Every raised one hand, and the gun crews froze in place. "Hold your fire." The order carried calmly across the deck. For younger sailors, every instinct urged them to answer the Mogul ship's cannon with a broadside of their own. The thunder of battle had begun, and doing nothing felt unnatural. But the older hands knew exactly what their captain intended. 17th century naval combat was rarely won by whoever fired first. It was won by whoever fired effectively. Every wanted his cannons close enough that every iron ball would strike timber instead of open water. The Fancy continued forward. The wind pressed firmly into her sails, and the ship leaned gracefully as she closed the gap. Cannon smoke from the Fateh Mohammed drifted slowly across the sea, partially hiding the escort ship from view. Then another flash appeared through the haze. A second broadside. This time the cannonballs came dangerously close. One smashed through the waves only yards from the pirate's ship, showering the bow with seawater. Another whistled high above the mainmast before disappearing into the distance. Still, Every refused to answer. Instead, he adjusted course by only a few degrees. It was a subtle maneuver, almost invisible to anyone unfamiliar with sailing. But it forced the escort ship to continue correcting its own position, preventing its gunners from finding an easy rhythm. The sea itself had become part of the battle. Below deck, the atmosphere was tense. The gun deck was dimly lit by hanging lanterns that swung with every roll of the ship. The smell of sulfur, tar, damp oak, and sweat filled the cramped space. Each cannon crew waited in silence. Powder charges had already been rammed home. Iron shot rested beside every gun. The slow-burning match cords glowed faintly in the darkness, ready to ignite the moment the order arrived. No one spoke. The only sounds were the groan of the hull and the distant thunder of enemy cannon. Aboard the Fateh Mohammed, confusion was beginning to spread. Its officers had expected the pirates either to retreat under heavy fire or rush recklessly into battle. Instead, the English captain advanced with remarkable patience. The pirate ship seemed almost indifferent to the incoming cannonballs. That calm unsettled them. Their gunners hurried to reload, but black powder artillery was painfully slow. Every shot required cleaning the barrel, measuring powder, ramming home the charge, loading the iron ball, and carefully aiming once again. Those precious minutes gave the Fancy exactly what Every wanted: distance, or rather, the absence of it. "Now," Every said quietly. The order rippled across the ship. A heartbeat later, the pirate broadside erupted. The roar was overwhelming. The entire Fancy shuddered as its cannons discharged together. Flames burst from the gun ports, followed instantly by thick clouds of white smoke that swallowed the ship's lower deck. Iron balls screamed across the water. Several smashed into the escort vessel's hull with terrifying force. Heavy splinters exploded from thick wooden planks, becoming deadly missiles that injured sailors standing nearby. One cannon carriage overturned under the impact, while shattered railings crashed onto the crowded deck. The pirates cheered, but Every did not. He simply watched. The battle had only begun. The Fateh Mohammed answered with another volley. This time, fortune favored the Mogul crew. A heavy cannonball struck the Fancy near the waterline, splintering thick oak and sending jagged fragments through the lower deck. One pirate gunner collapsed instantly, while two others cried out in pain as flying timber tore through their arms and shoulders. The cheers vanished. War had become brutally real. Smoke drifted between the ships. reducing visibility until they appeared as dark shadows separated by only a short stretch of sea. Above them, terrified seabirds circled wildly before disappearing into the distance. Every move calmly among his crew. He paused beside the wounded men, speaking only briefly before turning back toward the quarterdeck. His composure steadied the ship. Panic spreads quickly at sea. So does confidence. The pirates returned to their work with renewed determination. Cannons were reloaded. Rigging was repaired. Buckets of seawater extinguished small fires caused by burning wadding. Every sailor understood that hesitation could prove fatal. As the battle continued, something unexpected happened. The larger Mogul treasure ship, the Ganjai Sawai, continued sailing ahead. The escort vessel had done exactly what it was intended to do. It had slowed the attackers. For a brief moment, Henry Every faced the greatest decision of his career. Should he continue fighting the escort until it surrendered, or abandon it and pursue the greatest treasure ever to sail these waters? The answer would determine not only the outcome of the battle, but how history would remember his name. For several long moments, Henry Every said nothing. Smoke drifted lazily across the sea between the Fancy and the battered Fateh Mohammed, carrying with it the bitter smell of burnt powder and scorched timber. Cannon crews on both ships worked furiously, their faces blackened with soot as they hauled heavy guns back into position. The cries of the wounded mixed with shouted commands, while broken spars floated in the churning water between the two vessels. Beyond the haze, however, another sight held Every's attention. Far ahead, the towering silhouette of the Ganjai Sawai was slowly disappearing toward the horizon. That was the real prize. Every knew that if he remained locked in a prolonged battle with the escort, the treasure ship might escape entirely. Months of planning, thousands of miles of sailing, and every risk the crew had taken since leaving England would have been for nothing. He lowered his telescope and looked across the deck. "Break away," he ordered. For a heartbeat, several officers stared at him in disbelief. Leaving an enemy during battle was a dangerous decision. The Fateh Mohammed was damaged but still capable of fighting. Turning away exposed the pirate ship to another broadside. Yet Every understood something many commanders never did. Victory is not about destroying every opponent. It is about achieving the objective. The objective had never been the escort. It had always been the treasure. The helm turned. The Fancy caught the wind and surged forward, leaving the damaged escort struggling to reorganize. Confusion spread aboard the Mogul vessel as its officers realized the pirates were not retreating. They were racing after the convoy's largest ship. Ahead, the Ganjai Sawai finally recognized the danger. Signal flags climbed its towering mast. Drums echoed across its crowded decks as officers shouted orders to prepare for battle. Soldiers rushed toward rows of heavy cannons lining the gun deck, while passengers gathered valuables, offered prayers, or simply stood frozen in fear. The ship was immense, nearly twice the size of the Fancy. It carried hundreds of passengers in addition to merchants, sailors, and armed guards. Thick wooden sides protected its valuable cargo, and its guns outnumbered those of the pirate vessel. On paper, the outcome seemed obvious. The larger ship should have overwhelmed the attackers. But battles at sea rarely followed paper calculations. The sea itself always had the final vote. As the Fancy gained steadily, Every resisted the temptation to attack immediately. He watched the changing wind, the movement of the swells, and the slight delay in the treasure ship's turns. A vessel of such size could not maneuver quickly. Every adjustment required time, and time was exactly what the pirates intended to exploit. The gap narrowed. 200 yards. 150. 100. The faces of the Mogul sailors became visible across the water. Some loaded muskets. Others struggled to swing the heavy cannons into position. The air grew unnaturally still, as though the ocean itself sensed what was about to happen. Then, without warning, the Ganjai Sawai fired. A tremendous explosion shattered the silence as one of its largest guns discharged. Smoke erupted from the side of the ship, but almost immediately something went terribly wrong. According to several historical accounts, one of the treasure ship's heavy cannons either burst or malfunctioned during the exchange. The explosion killed or injured members of its own gun crew and created confusion on board at the worst possible moment. While historians debate the exact details, contemporary reports agree that the ship's opening defense was far less effective than its size suggested. Henry Every needed no second invitation. "Run alongside," he shouted. The Fancy accelerated under full sail, closing the final distance with astonishing speed. Grappling hooks were carried to the rails. Muskets were primed. Cutlasses flashed in the morning sunlight. The pirates were no longer thinking about the escort they had left behind. Every eye was fixed on the towering walls of timber rising beside them. Within moments, they would attempt one of the boldest boarding actions in pirate history. Whether they emerged as legends or vanished beneath the waters of the Indian Ocean will be decided on the enemy's deck. The two ships drifted so close together that the sound of individual voices could now be heard across the narrow strip of water separating them. The Unsealed towered above the Fancy like a floating fortress. Its high wooden sides cast a long shadow over the smaller pirate ship, while rows of gun ports and crowded decks revealed just how heavily manned the vessel truly was. Hundreds of people were aboard. Experienced sailors, armed guards, wealthy merchants, pilgrims returning from the Hajj, and servants responsible for protecting one of the richest cargoes sailing anywhere in the world. For a brief moment, everything seemed to stand still. The sea rolled gently beneath both ships. The wind fluttered loose strands of canvas. Then Henry Every gave the order. Grappling hooks. Heavy iron hooks spun through the air, trailing thick hemp ropes behind them. One after another, they crashed into the treasure ship's railings, digging deep into the timber. Pirate sailors immediately hauled on the ropes with all their strength, pulling the two vessels together until the hulls collided with a deep, splintering groan that echoed across the water. There would be no escape now. The battle had become hand-to-hand. The first pirates climbed the ropes with astonishing speed. Muskets fired from above, filling the air with thick clouds of white smoke. Bullets splintered the deck beneath their boots, while fragments of shattered wood flew in every direction. One pirate lost his grip and disappeared into the sea below. Another reached the enemy railing only to be struck backward by a musket ball. Still, the attack continued. Every knew that hesitation would allow the defenders to regain their confidence. Momentum was everything. With cutlass in one hand and pistol in the other, he was among the first to reach the enemy deck. The fighting that followed was fierce and chaotic. Visibility dropped to only a few yards as cannon smoke drifted between the masts. Shouts in English, Persian, Arabic, and several Indian languages blended into a single roar. Steel clashed against steel. Muskets fired at close range, their flashes briefly illuminating faces blackened by powder and sweat. There was no neat battle line, only confusion. Small groups fought wherever they found themselves, around hatchways, beside cannon, along the quarterdeck, and near the towering mainmast. The deck itself became dangerously slippery from spilled seawater, shattered barrels, and the debris left behind by exploding cannonballs. Despite their numerical advantage, many aboard the Unsealed struggled to coordinate a unified defense. The sudden malfunction of one of the ship's heavy guns had already shaken confidence. Thick smoke made communication difficult, and the towering size of the vessel meant that orders took valuable time to travel from one end of the deck to the other. Henry Every exploited every moment of uncertainty. Rather than allowing his men to scatter across the ship, he directed them toward key positions: the gun deck, the helm, and the stairways connecting the upper and lower decks. If those areas could be controlled, the defenders would find it increasingly difficult to organize a counterattack. The battle seemed to last forever. In reality, historians believe the struggle unfolded over a relatively short period compared with many naval engagements. Yet for those caught within it, every minute felt impossibly long. The crash of waves against the hull, the sharp smell of burn powder, the cries of the wounded, the splintering of centuries-old teak under cannon fire. These memories would remain with the survivors long after the treasure had changed hands. Gradually, the resistance weakened. Groups of defenders laid down their weapons. Others retreated below deck. Several officers attempted to rally their men, but the momentum had shifted decisively. The pirates had secured the upper decks. They now controlled the ship. For Henry Every, the victory was extraordinary. He had captured one of the richest vessels in the Mogul fleet with a crew far smaller than that of his opponent. Yet the greatest discovery still lay beneath his feet. Hidden deep inside the ship's holds were locked chests, sealed strong rooms, and valuable cargo collected from across the Indian Ocean trade network. The fortune Every had chased halfway around the world was finally within reach. But that victory would carry consequences far beyond anything he, or anyone aboard the Fancy, could have imagined. Because the capture of the Ganjai Sawai was not merely an act of piracy. It was an international crisis. News of the attack would soon reach the court of Emperor Aurangzeb. It would outrage the Mughal Empire, shake the English East India Company's position in India, and force the English crown to launch one of the first global manhunts in recorded history. The pirates believed they had won unimaginable wealth. They had, but they had also made themselves the most hunted men on Earth. When the fighting finally subsided, an uneasy silence settled over the Ganjai Sawai. The roar of cannon faded into the distance, replaced by the gentle creak of timber and the rhythmic sound of waves striking the hull. Smoke still drifted lazily across the deck, softening the morning sunlight into a pale gray haze. Broken muskets, shattered spars, lengths of torn rope, and fragments of splintered teak lay scattered where the battle had raged only moments before. For the first time since the chase had begun, Henry Every allowed himself a slow look across the captured vessel. The victory was real, but it had come at a cost. Several of his own men had been killed. Others sat against the railings while companions wrapped wounds with strips of linen already stained dark with blood. A ship's surgeon moved quietly among them with the limited tools available in the 17th century. Needles, bandages, crude knives, and bottles of strong spirits used as much for courage as for medicine. There was little celebration. Experienced sailors understood that surviving the battle was only the beginning. Now came the task that had drawn them halfway around the world. Finding the treasure. Armed guard were posted at every hatchway, while trusted members of the crew descended below deck carrying lanterns. The air inside the vast ship felt heavy and close. Moisture clung to the wooden beams overhead, and the smell of spices, damp canvas, lamp oil, and salt filled the narrow passageways. Every compartment seemed to reveal another reminder of the immense trading world connected by the Indian Ocean. There were bales of fine silk from Asia, bundles of expensive textiles, ivory, pepper, indigo, porcelain packed carefully in straw, boxes of fragrant spices whose value in European markets often exceeded their weight in silver. Yet these goods, valuable as they were not what Henry Every had crossed oceans to find. He was searching for the ship's strong rooms. Eventually, a sailor called from deep within the hold. "Captain, you should see this." Lantern light flickered across rows of heavy wooden chests reinforced with iron bands. Some bore the seals of wealthy merchants. Others carried the markings of imperial officials responsible for transporting taxes and private fortunes across the Mughal Empire. One by one, the locks were broken. The first chest revealed neatly stacked silver coins. The second contained gold. The third overflowed with pearls wrapped carefully in cloth. Another held unset diamonds, emeralds, rubies, and sapphires collected through decades of trade stretching from India to Persia and beyond. Even hardened pirates stood silently for a moment. Many had dreamed of fortunes beyond imagination. Few had expected to witness one with their own eyes. Exactly how much treasure was captured has been debated by historians for centuries. Contemporary reports varied widely, and the value of coins, jewels, and trade goods changed over time. Modern historians generally agree, however, that the total haul amounted to hundreds of thousands of pounds sterling in 17th century money, a staggering sum that would equal many tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars in today's terms, depending on the method of calculation. Whatever the precise figure, one fact is beyond dispute. It was among the richest prizes ever taken by pirates. For the crew of the Fancy, the discovery transformed years of hardship into unimaginable wealth. Ordinary sailors who had once struggled to collect unpaid wages suddenly found themselves richer than successful merchants. A single share of the treasure could support a family for generations. It was the dream that had driven countless men toward piracy. Few ever achieved it. Henry Every had. Yet beneath the excitement, another reality slowly emerged. Among those aboard the Unsealed were not only merchants and sailors, but also pilgrims and passengers whose lives had been shattered by the attack. Contemporary historical accounts describe widespread suffering following the capture of the ship. Some reports, particularly those written in the aftermath, contain allegations of serious abuses committed during and after the boarding. Historians continue to examine these sources carefully, and while individual details remain debated, there is broad agreement that the attack caused profound human tragedy beyond the loss of property alone. That tragedy would have consequences reaching far beyond the Indian Ocean. When news arrived at the court of Emperor Aurangzeb, it was received not simply as an act of piracy, but as a grave insult to the honor and authority of the Mughal Empire. Merchants demanded justice. Imperial officials demanded arrests. Public anger spread through important trading ports. And because the attackers were English, suspicion quickly fell upon English merchants living and working in India, even though the English East India Company had not organized or supported the attack. The distinction mattered little to those demanding accountability. Thousands of miles away in London, officials had no idea that events unfolding in distant waters were about to become an international crisis. What had begun as a pirate raid was now threatening diplomatic relations between one of the world's most powerful empires and England itself. The treasure aboard the Unsealed had changed hands. Now the political consequences would begin, and those consequences would force governments, merchants, and navies across 3 continents into an unprecedented hunt for one man. Henry Every, the pirate who had become richer than almost anyone imagined, and in doing so, had become the most wanted fugitive in the world. The treasure had been divided. The guns had fallen silent. The Indian Ocean, which only days earlier had echoed with cannon fire and desperate cries, once again appeared calm beneath the tropical sun. Gentle waves rolled endlessly toward the horizon, as though the sea itself were eager to erase every sign of the battle that had just changed history. But history does not disappear as easily as footprints in the sand. It travels with people, with merchants, with sailors, with survivors. Within weeks, news of the attack began spreading from port to port faster than any pirate ship could sail. A frightened merchant carried the story to Muscat. A surviving sailor repeated it in Mocha. Letters were dispatched towards Surat, where officials of the Mughal Empire struggled to understand how such a disaster could have happened. Every retelling grew more dramatic. Some claimed the pirates numbered in the thousands. Others insisted they possessed supernatural courage or impossible luck. The facts changed with each telling. The outrage did not. When word finally reached the court of Emperor Aurangzeb, the reaction was immediate and uncompromising. For the Mughal ruler, this was far more than a robbery. The attack had struck a vessel under imperial protection. Wealth belonging to influential merchants had been stolen. Pilgrims returning from one of Islam's holiest journeys had suffered greatly. Just as importantly, the prestige of one of the world's most powerful empires had been publicly challenged on the open sea. Aurangzeb demanded action. Officials throughout the empire were ordered to investigate. Local governors questioned merchants, sailors, and foreign traders. Attention quickly turned toward the English. Not because the English government had authorized the attack. It had not, but because witnesses identified many of the pirates as English-speaking seamen. In an age when communication between continents could take months, distinctions between pirates, private citizens, and governments were often blurred. The English East India Company suddenly found itself facing a crisis it had never intended to create. At the company's factories in Surat and other trading ports, fear spread rapidly. Company officials depended upon the goodwill of Mughal authorities to conduct business. Their warehouses were filled with valuable goods awaiting export to Europe. Hundreds of English employees lived under Mughal jurisdiction. If the emperor chose retaliation, decades of profitable trade could collapse almost overnight. Some company servants were detained. Trade slowed. Negotiations became tense. London had built its commercial future upon access to Indian markets. Now one pirate captain threatened to destroy it all. When reports finally reached England, the Crown recognized the danger almost immediately. This was no ordinary act of piracy. It had become a diplomatic emergency. The government could not simply ignore the attack without risking severe consequences for English commerce and foreign relations. So an extraordinary decision was made. Rewards would be offered. Governors across England's colonies received descriptions of Henry Every and his associates. Captains were instructed to watch for the fancy. Merchants were encouraged to report suspicious strangers suddenly spending large quantities of gold or jewels. For perhaps the first time in history, authorities across Europe, Africa, the Caribbean, and the American colonies were pursuing the same fugitive. It was, in many ways, one of the world's earliest international manhunts. Meanwhile, Henry Every understood that the greatest danger no longer came from naval cannon. It came from recognition. A pirate carrying enormous wealth could not simply sail into a busy harbor unnoticed. Gold attracted attention. Jewels invited questions. Former allies became potential informants. Every realized that survival now required something more difficult than capturing treasure. He had to disappear. The Fancy altered course once again, avoiding the busiest sea lanes whenever possible. The crew discussed where they might safely divide the remaining treasure. Some dreamed of returning quietly to England under false names. Others considered settling in the Caribbean, where piracy still flourished despite growing efforts to suppress it. A few believed Madagascar offered the safest refuge. Every listened carefully. He understood that keeping a large pirate crew together after such an enormous success might prove more dangerous than facing an enemy fleet. The larger the group, the greater the chance that someone would eventually betray the others. One evening, as the sun disappeared beneath the western horizon, the captain gathered his senior officers. A chart lay open across the cabin table. Its edges were stained by salt and years of use. Every traced a route with his finger. No one outside the room would know the full plan. The fewer people who knew their destination, the safer they would be. It was a decision that reflected the same careful patience that had carried him from an unpaid sailor to the richest pirate in history. Yet no amount of planning could fully protect him now, because somewhere beyond the horizon, governors, admirals, merchants, bounty hunters, and even former pirates had begun searching for the same man. Not for his ship, not for his crew, for Henry Every himself. The greatest pirate fortune in history had bought him unimaginable wealth, but it had also purchased something far more dangerous. A lifetime spent looking over his shoulder. The greatest mystery surrounding Henry Every did not begin with the capture of the Ganjai Sawai. It began afterward. History remembers many famous pirates because they died dramatic deaths. Some were hanged before cheering crowds. Others fell in bloody battles against naval forces, their names recorded in official reports and newspaper accounts. Their stories had clear endings. Henry Every's did not. His story slowly disappeared into silence. In the months following the raid, the Fancy remained one of the most sought-after ships on the world's oceans. Naval commanders expected that such an extraordinary prize would eventually force the pirates into a major port. After all, ships required repairs. Fresh water had to be collected. Food had to be purchased. Crews rarely remained together forever. Surely someone would recognize them. Surely someone would betray them. Governments believed it was only a matter of time. Yet Every seemed to understand one final truth about survival. A famous pirate could never remain famous if he wished to stay alive. Rather than seeking another spectacular victory, he did something almost no one expected. He disappeared. Historical evidence suggests that after dividing much of the treasure, the crew gradually separated. Small groups traveled in different directions, making it far more difficult for authorities to track them. A handful of pirates were eventually captured in the Caribbean and elsewhere. Some stood trial. Several were executed as a warning to others. But Henry Every was not among them. The man everyone wanted had slipped away. One of the strongest historical theories places Every in the Bahamas, then a region where piracy, smuggling, and informal trade often overlapped. Another suggests he quietly returned to Ireland or southwest England under a false identity. Other accounts claim he sought refuge in the American colonies. None of these stories can be confirmed with certainty. That uncertainty has become part of his legend. Unlike many pirates whose lives are documented from beginning to end, Every left historians with fragments rather than conclusions. Meanwhile, the hunt continued. Official notices described him as an experienced English seaman of average height with dark features and a confident manner. Rewards were advertised across the English-speaking world. Governors received detailed instructions to question suspicious arrivals. Merchants were encouraged to report anyone attempting to exchange unusually large quantities of foreign gold or jewels. For the late 17th century, the effort was remarkable. Without telephones, without photography, without fingerprints, governments still managed to coordinate information across thousands of miles of ocean. The search itself marked an important moment in the history of international law enforcement. Not everyone remained silent. Over the years, stories began circulating in taverns from London to Boston. Some claimed Henry Every had retired comfortably with unimaginable wealth, living quietly under another name. Others insisted he had been cheated by dishonest merchants who exchanged his treasure for worthless promises. One tale suggested he died poor and forgotten, unable to spend the fortune that had made him famous. Another imagined him purchasing an estate somewhere in the English countryside, walking unnoticed among neighbors who never realized they greeted the world's most wanted pirate. Each story contained just enough possibility to survive. None contained enough evidence to prove it. For modern historians, that uncertainty presents both a challenge and an opportunity. The surviving records allow us to reconstruct the attack on the Ganjai Sawai, the diplomatic crisis that followed, and the unprecedented search launched by governments. But they cannot tell us with confidence how Henry Every spent his final years. Sometimes history preserves its greatest events. Sometimes it loses its central character. Perhaps that is why Every has remained so fascinating for more than 3 centuries. He did what countless pirates dreamed of doing. He captured an extraordinary fortune. He escaped the gallows. And then, he vanished. No confirmed grave has ever been identified. No verified final letter survives. No reliable eyewitness account describes his last days. His disappearance became the final chapter of the mystery. Yet his legacy continued to echo long after the man himself was gone. Because the consequences of that single attack reached far beyond one pirate, one ship, or one empire. They helped change the way nations fought piracy across the world's oceans. And in doing so, Henry Every unknowingly contributed to the beginning of the end of the great age of pirates. Years after Henry Every vanished from history, the effects of his greatest raid continued to ripple across the globe. The stolen treasure had long since been divided. The fancy was gone. Many of the men who had sailed beside Every had either disappeared into new identities, been captured by colonial authorities, or died far from the seas that had once made them wealthy. Yet the consequences of their actions refused to fade. In London, directors of the English East India Company found themselves facing one of the gravest crises in the company's history. For decades, its success had depended upon a fragile relationship with the Mughal Empire. English merchants did not rule India at this point in history. They were guests, allowed to trade only because the emperor permitted them to do so. That permission was suddenly in danger. Emperor Aurangzeb demanded accountability. Mughal officials expected compensation for the immense losses suffered during the attack. The pressure on the English East India Company grew with each passing month. Warehouses that had once bustled with trade now stood under the watchful eyes of Mughal officials. Merchants who had spent decades building commercial relationships suddenly found themselves answering difficult questions they could not fully control. They had not planned the attack, financed it, or profited from it. Yet in the eyes of many within the Mughal Empire, those distinctions mattered very little. The pirates were English, and England, somehow, would have to answer for what they had done. For the English crown, the situation was equally alarming. By the closing years of the 17th century, overseas trade had become one of England's greatest sources of wealth. Ships returning from Asia carried spices, textiles, tea, porcelain, and luxury goods that transformed both the economy and everyday life. A prolonged conflict with the Mughal Empire threatened far more than diplomatic embarrassment. It threatened the future of English commerce in the East. As a result, piracy was no longer viewed as a distant nuisance that affected only unlucky merchants. It had become a matter of national security. The pursuit of Henry Every helped reshape how governments thought about maritime crime. Colonial governors received clearer instructions. Admirals were expected to cooperate across oceans. Courts developed new legal mechanisms to prosecute piracy, even when crimes had been committed thousands of miles away from England itself. Information traveled slowly by modern standards, but governments increasingly understood that criminals operating across international waters required a coordinated response. In many respects, Every's raid became a turning point. It demonstrated that a relatively small group of determined men could trigger a diplomatic crisis between two of the world's most powerful states. It also revealed how deeply connected the world had already become. An attack in the Indian Ocean could disrupt trade in London, create political tension in India, affect merchants in Arabia, and provoke responses across the Atlantic colonies. The age we now call globalization did not begin in the 20th century. Its foundations were already visible in the wooden ships that crossed the world's oceans more than 300 years ago. Henry Every's story also changed the public imagination. During the decades that followed, writers began publishing sensational accounts of pirates. Some mixed fact with fiction. Others exaggerated battles, invented conversations, or transformed ruthless criminals into larger-than-life adventurers. Readers across Britain and Europe eagerly consumed these stories, fascinated by lives lived beyond the reach of ordinary law. The reality, however, remained far less romantic. Piracy was dangerous. Most pirates never became wealthy. Many died young from disease, storms, violence, or execution. The overwhelming majority never achieved anything close to the success Henry Every experienced. His career was extraordinary precisely because it was so unusual. One spectacular victory, one enormous fortune, one unexplained disappearance. History has produced countless thieves. Very few escaped with both their treasure and their freedom. Even today, historians continue to debate aspects of Every's life. New documents occasionally emerge from archives in Britain, India, and elsewhere, offering small pieces of a much larger puzzle. Researchers compare shipping records, court proceedings, private correspondence, and government reports, hoping to discover what became of the man whose actions briefly shook the balance of global trade. Some questions have found answers. Others remain stubbornly beyond our reach. Perhaps they always will. That uncertainty is part of what keeps Henry Every's story alive. Not because he was the most violent pirate, not because he commanded the largest fleet, but because he achieved something that almost no pirate in history ever managed. He struck the richest prize of his age, and then vanished before the world could catch him. In the next and final chapter, we will step back from the chase, the battles, and the treasure to ask a larger question. Who was Henry Every, really? Was he a ruthless criminal? A desperate sailor pushed beyond his limits? A brilliant strategist? Or simply a man who found one extraordinary opportunity in an age when the oceans connected empires and chose to seize it? There's a curious pattern that appears throughout history. The people who change the course of the world are not always the ones who leave behind the clearest records. Some vanish in a legend. Others become trapped somewhere between documented fact and popular imagination, where every generation adds another layer to the story. Over time, certainty fades, speculation grows, and the line between history and folklore becomes increasingly difficult to recognize. Henry Every occupies that uncertain space. More than 3 centuries after he disappeared, historians still agree on one remarkable fact. We know far more about the consequences of his actions than we do about the final years of his life. That is an extraordinary legacy. Most criminals are remembered for the way their lives ended. Henry Every is remembered because no one can say with confidence how his life ended at all. The first stories began almost immediately after his disappearance. In the taverns of London, Bristol, and Plymouth, sailors claimed to have seen him living quietly under another name. Some insisted he had settled in the Caribbean, purchasing land through intermediaries so that no one would connect him with the infamous pirate captain. Others believed he had returned to Ireland, where a false identity allowed him to disappear among ordinary farming communities. These tales spread quickly because people wanted to believe them. There is something irresistible about the idea that the world's most wanted pirate had successfully outwitted kings, admirals, governors, and merchants alike. Yet stories are not evidence. When historians search for proof, the trail becomes surprisingly thin. No verified legal document confirms that Henry Every purchased an estate. No authenticated diary places him in a colonial settlement. No signed letter has ever been discovered in which he reflected on his remarkable escape. The silence is almost complete. One of the oldest traditions claims that Every secretly returned to England. According to later writers, he arrived with enormous wealth, but found it difficult to convert foreign coins, jewels, and precious goods into usable money without attracting suspicion. Unscrupulous merchants allegedly cheated him, taking much of his fortune in exchange for promises that were never fulfilled. In this version of the story, the richest pirate in history dies poor. It is a powerful tale, almost poetic, a warning that crime ultimately destroys those who profit from it. But there is one problem. The evidence for it is extremely weak. Most modern historians treat the account with caution because it appeared years after the events and cannot be independently verified. It may contain fragments of truth. It may be entirely fictional. We simply do not know. Another theory suggests that Every never returned to Europe at all. Instead, he may have blended into one of the growing port communities scattered across the Atlantic world. Colonial ports were filled with former sailors, merchants, laborers, escaped servants, and immigrants from many different countries. A man who changed his name, altered his appearance, and avoided drawing attention to himself could, in theory, disappear remarkably well, especially in an age without passports, photographs, or centralized records. To modern readers, it may seem almost impossible. To people living in the 17th century, it was far more plausible. There is also the possibility that Henry Every died not long after his greatest success. Disease remained one of the deadliest threats facing sailors. Malaria, yellow fever, dysentery, and countless other illnesses claimed lives every year. Even a minor wound could become fatal before the age of antibiotics. If Every died quietly in an isolated settlement, far from government officials or newspaper printers, the event might never have entered the historical record. History often preserves spectacular moments. It frequently loses ordinary endings. What makes Henry Every's disappearance so fascinating is not merely the mystery itself. It is what that mystery reveals about the world he lived in. The oceans of the late 17th century were vast beyond imagination. Communication depended upon the wind. A letter could take months to cross from India to England. News was delayed, distorted, and sometimes lost forever. Governments possessed impressive naval power, yet even they struggled to monitor the endless coastlines, hidden anchorages, and distant islands connected by global trade. In such a world, an experienced sailor with money, patience, and a convincing false identity possessed advantages that few modern fugitives could ever hope to enjoy. Perhaps that explains why Henry Every became more than a pirate. He became a symbol. To governments, he represented the dangers of unchecked piracy. To merchants, he represented the vulnerability of global trade. To later generations, he became the pirate who achieved what almost no outlaw ever managed. He disappeared while the entire world was searching for him. In the next chapter, we leave the mystery of the man behind and examine the legacy he left upon history, a legacy that influenced the final decades of the great age of sail and changed the fight against piracy forever. History has a habit of remembering the loudest battles, the clash of armies, the fall of kingdoms, the coronation of kings. Yet some of history's most important turning points begin with a single event that seems, at first, almost isolated. Only years later do people realize that the consequences reached much farther than anyone could have imagined. The capture of the Ganjai Sawai was one of those moments. When Henry Every and his crew sailed away with one of the richest prizes ever taken at sea, they believed they had secured their own futures. They could not have known that their success would influence international trade, colonial policy, maritime law, and even the popular image of pirates for generations to come. In the years that followed, governments across Europe gradually adopted a far more determined approach to piracy. Naval patrols became more frequent in key shipping lanes. Colonial governors faced increasing pressure to arrest, not shelter, pirates seeking refuge in distant ports. Merchant companies invested more heavily in armed escorts, improved intelligence, and cooperation with local authorities. The oceans did not suddenly become safe, but they became far less forgiving for men who chose the pirate's life. Ironically, Henry Every's extraordinary success may have inspired a new generation of pirates, even as governments intensified their efforts to destroy them. Stories of his raids spread through taverns from London to Boston, from Nassau to Port Royal. Sailors listened in amazement as veterans described the English captain who had crossed half the world, captured a Mogul treasure ship, and disappeared before any navy could bring him to justice. To young seamen living on poor wages and uncertain prospects, the tale sounded almost unbelievable. One successful voyage, a fortune beyond imagination, freedom from poverty. For many, the risks seemed worth taking. Within a few decades, the Atlantic entered what historians now call the golden age of piracy. Figures such as Blackbeard, Charles Vane, Bartholomew Roberts, and Calico Jack Rackham would become far more famous in popular culture than Henry Every himself. Yet, those later pirates operated in a world that Every had already helped to change. Governments had learned from his escape. The response was faster. The pursuit was broader. The punishments were harsher. Many of the pirates who followed him ended not in quiet retirement, but on the gallows. There is another irony hidden within every story. He became one of history's most famous pirates despite leading a remarkably short pirate career. Unlike Blackbeard, who terrorized the American colonies for years, or Bartholomew Roberts, who captured hundreds of ships, Henry Every's reputation rests largely upon a single expedition. One voyage, one extraordinary prize, one disappearance. Few individuals have accomplished so much in so little time. That fact alone distinguishes him from almost every other pirate remembered today. Modern historians also view Henry Every as a reminder that piracy was never simply a collection of adventurous sea stories. It emerged from real economic conditions. Many pirates had once been merchant sailors, naval seamen, or privateers. They lived in a world of dangerous work, uncertain wages, and harsh discipline. None of this excuses the violence and suffering caused by piracy. Innocent people were robbed, injured, and killed, and the attack on the Ganjai Sawai remains one of the most devastating pirate assaults ever recorded. Understanding why piracy existed is not the same as celebrating it. History asks us to examine both the circumstances that shaped people's choices and the consequences those choices produced. Henry Every's life illustrates that complexity. He was neither the romantic hero imagined by later fiction nor merely a name on a wanted poster. He was a skilled sailor, an effective leader, and a man who committed acts that caused profound human suffering while also exposing the vulnerabilities of a rapidly globalizing world. Perhaps that contradiction explains why historians continue to study him. As the 18th century progressed, the great era of piracy slowly faded. Naval power expanded. Trade routes became better protected. International cooperation improved. The seas that had once offered sanctuary to outlaws became increasingly difficult places in which to hide. The age that had allowed Henry every to vanish began to disappear with him. Yet his story refused to sink beneath the waves. More than 300 years later, researchers still search dusty archives, forgotten shipping records, and faded court documents, hoping that somewhere, perhaps in an overlooked letter or an uncatalogued ledger, a final clue might reveal what became of the pirate who stole an empire's treasure. Perhaps that document still exists. Perhaps it was lost centuries ago. Until then, Henry Every remains one of history's greatest unanswered mysteries. In our final chapter, we step away from the documents and the debates to reflect on what this remarkable story reveals, not only about one pirate, but about ambition, fortune, power, and the unpredictable currents of history itself. As the sun sinks beneath the horizon, the Indian Ocean begins to look much as it did more than 300 years ago. The waves rise and fall with quiet certainty. The wind fills invisible paths that sailors once trusted with their lives. Somewhere beneath those waters lie broken anchors, rusted cannonballs, fragments of wooden hulls, and countless stories that no document ever recorded. The sea has always been history's greatest archive, not because it preserves everything, but because it reminds us how much has been lost. Henry Every has become one of those lost stories. Not entirely forgotten, not completely understood, simply unfinished. That unfinished ending is what continues to fascinate historians. We know the broad outline of his extraordinary journey. An experienced English sailor, frustrated by broken promises and unpaid wages, took part in a mutiny that transformed an ordinary ship into the pirate vessel Fancy. He sailed farther than most European pirates ever dared, crossed the Cape of Good Hope, entered the Indian Ocean, and patiently waited for an opportunity that many believed would never come. When that opportunity finally appeared, it changed everything. The capture of the Ganges Sawai was more than a spectacular robbery. It exposed the fragile connections that held together the world's expanding trade networks. A single attack at sea disrupted diplomacy between England and the Mughal Empire, threatened the future of international commerce, and prompted governments to cooperate in ways that had rarely been attempted before. In many respects, Henry Every's raid demonstrated that the oceans connected distant civilizations far more closely than people of his age fully realized. Yet history should not confuse success with virtue. The wealth seized during that attack came at a profound human cost. Merchants lost fortunes built over lifetimes. Families were torn apart. Survivors carried the memory of violence long after the treasure itself had been scattered across the world. Modern scholarship reminds us that piracy was never merely adventure. Behind every captured ship were ordinary people whose lives have been permanently altered. That truth deserves to be remembered alongside the legend. Perhaps that is why Henry Every remains such a compelling figure. He does not fit neatly into a single category. He was neither a fearless hero nor a one-dimensional villain. He was a highly skilled navigator living in an age of expanding empires, fierce commercial competition, and extraordinary inequality. His choices were his own, and those choices brought him immense wealth while causing immense suffering. Both realities belong to the historical record. The mystery surrounding his final years only deepens that complexity. Did he quietly build a new life under another name? Did illness claim him before anyone recognized who he was? Did he spend his fortune, lose it, or hide it where no one would ever find it? 3 centuries later, the evidence remains incomplete. Historians continue to search archives, compare shipping records, and re-examine forgotten correspondence, hoping that one overlooked document might finally answer the question that has echoed across generations. So far, the silence has endured. And perhaps that silence is fitting. The sea has always rewarded patience. It has also guarded its secrets. Every generation looks back at the age of sail with a mixture of admiration and caution. We admire the courage required to cross oceans using little more than wind, stars, and experience. We are fascinated by the discoveries, the rival empires, and the extraordinary people who shaped that era. At the same time, we must remember that these achievements were often accompanied by conflict, exploitation, and hardship. History becomes most meaningful when we resist the temptation to simplify it. Henry Every's life reminds us that history is rarely a tale of pure heroes or pure villains. More often, it is the story of flawed human beings making decisions in extraordinary circumstances, leaving consequences that outlast their own lives. Today, ships far larger than the Fancy cross the Indian Ocean every hour. Satellites watch the sea from space. Modern navigation systems guide vessels with astonishing precision. Yet the same winds still sweep across the water, and the same horizon stretches endlessly toward distant shores. Somewhere beneath those waves, the echoes of cannon fire have long since faded. The treasure has been spent. The ships have disappeared. The empires have changed. But the questions remain, and that is why, after more than 300 years, the story of Henry Every still refuses to disappear. Because sometimes the greatest mystery in history is not how a man became famous. It is how he vanished.